At the time of print, we're officially halfway through 2020. So far, we've experienced one of the most critical and strangest periods in existence. As we've isolated and kept indoors for a good duration of the year, our curiosity for exploring wide and sweeping worlds has only intensified since. Video games are the perfect solution to this conundrum, but it takes a world of intriguing design and purpose for players to want to explore it even when they're desperate. Enter Deadly Premonition 2, the follow-up to a cult classic known for its amalgamation of clashing development decisions and polarizing reception. Ask any fan why, and the conversation generally shifts towards overlooking the technical limitations for its unique take on survival horror and open-world design. 10 years since the release of the original game, and Deadly Premonition 2 aims to continue the weird but wonderful journey of FBI investigator and coffee enthusiast Francis York Morgan. Though the million-dollar question remains, does it manage to capture the same magic of its predecessor? Well, yes and no. Before we start elaborating on that answer, let's set the scene. Deadly Premonition 2 is set 5 years before the events of the first game, as Francis York Morgan is called to investigate the murder of a young woman in Le Carre, a small town just off the Mississippi River in the state of Louisiana. While this seems like a familiar setup, there are some changes. For example, the recently deceased was part of the Clarkson family, who effectively run most of Le Carre's food exports and as such exerts a large amount of influence within the community. As York usually does, he believes there's more than what meets the eye in this situation and immediately gets to work on the case, with his peppy assistant Patricia Woods, who acts as his investigation assistant and local tour guide. Without spoiling the rest of the plot, that's generally the main hook of the game. Like the previous title in the series, Deadly Premonition 2 has a main questline working around a 24-hour in-game clock and a sprawling open world. This is where the game starts to show some major problems, both on a visual and technical level. While the world itself has some logical design and decent textures, it's mostly marred by a horrendous resolution and slideshow-like frame rate that will test the most patient of players. After playing a good chunk of the game in both handheld and docked modes, I couldn't seem to deduce the better way to play Deadly Premonition 2 aside from saving and restarting the game whenever the frame rate would dip for slightly better performance. It's a shame too, because a good portion of the game is played out in the open world, and while it's neat to see locals in the town making their way to work or patrolling through the streets in their flashy topless sedans, both of it happening in real time, it gets difficult convincing yourself to progress through the plot when the frame rate hits single digits in the overworld. After trying so long to rationalize it, I was really at a loss for words as to what was causing such drastic dips in performance. With a shockingly tiny LOD and draw distance, you'll see objects like trees, buildings, and roads constantly pop in and redraw themselves, so it's not like the game has to render hundreds of objects, animations, and textures at once. There may be an off chance that the Nintendo Switch isn't the ideal platform for current-gen open-world games, or that the game isn't particularly well optimized. Our take is unanimously on the latter. Thankfully, a lot of that changes when you're within buildings and subsequently forced into combat. Like its predecessor, Deadly Premonition 2 is compartmentalized into two major gameplay fronts, investigation and combat. The former concerns itself with locating clues and evidence leading York into the otherworld, a malicious representation or replication of Le Carre's landmark locations full of enemies to defeat and resources to gather. From here, this is where York is at his peak as an investigator as he reaches deductions and carries you to the next part of the investigation. As an action game, the combat mechanics are sound, the areas in which you fight in restrictive and oppressive, but as a survival horror game, it's perhaps too generous with consumable loot drops, to the point where it's very probable that you can clear the entire game without spending a cent on medkits or bullets. There are also opportunities to upgrade York's abilities through collecting materials to craft into charms and dolls that already trivializes a pretty simple difficulty curve. While the original game had unlimited ammunition for your base pistol, enemies were quick and resources were expensive and scarce enough to exercise caution. Despite that, the frame rate keeps up during these areas where it counts the most, so it's still serviceable as a fun diversion in between investigations. Now you're probably thinking that so far this review has been nothing but doom and gloom. However, from here, this is where most of my criticism with the game ends. What lies beneath is an intriguing whodunit that starts simple and eventually presents itself as a complex, nuanced trip into surrealist paradise. Aside from the plot going absolutely bonkers, the cast of Le Carré is what will keep you coming back for more, to the point where you'll have no problem braving some of the game's bigger issues. Specifically, the spoken back and forth between Patricia Woods and York, as well as the many side quests you can pick up throughout the overworld, will feature some great chemistry and dialogue you wouldn't want to miss out on. Characters are a delight to interact with, and even with a lead as eccentric as York, dealing with locals who speak in riddles or like they're narrating a film trailer, it never feels like anybody's fighting for screen time or one-upping each other. The only things that I feel miss the mark is the lack of a straight-laced character and some themes that are introduced but not quite fully explored well enough. For example, in the original game, some members of the Greenvale Police Department acted as a constant to York's ridiculous musings, and to a degree felt like an insert for the player. Deadly Premonition 2 might not have that, but it still works in favour of the game's tendency to go off the rails in a chaotic but positive way. Its tendency to go back and forth chronologically builds intrigue quite effectively, lending to its ability to grasp the player even when the pacing of the first few hours is a little off. As mentioned before, there are some questionable ways in which some themes are handled, particularly around minorities within the town of Le Carré. While it works thematically for a rural, close-knit town to collectively express their prejudices in roundabout ways, York's methods of addressing certain people in the cast feels a little bit out of character, especially for a self-proclaimed city boy with a tendency to constantly flex about their refined tastes and cultured upbringing. It is worth noting that some of these slides don't seem particularly facetious, but rather due to potential translation mishaps or cultural differences. Either way, the rest of the elements of Deadly Premonition 2's themes mesh well even if you decide to omit this part of York's character, though if you choose not to, it only adds to the idea that you might not know him as well as you think you do. And I consider that a fitting testament to what Deadly Premonition 2 represents. It's incredibly shocking that a game like this doesn't particularly run or look too well, but it still manages to garner as much charm as intrigue that it does. Despite playing for up to 30 hours, I still feel engrossed in its world, its characters, and setting in ways that not many other games can pull off. Strangely enough, Deadly Premonition 2 might not match its predecessor beat by beat, but it still gives off a wondrous nostalgic shimmer, almost as if I was playing one of the game's contemporaries like Mizona Falls, or even the first Deadly Premonition. Its initial pacing and technical limitations are bound to drive anybody nuts, but if you're patient and forgiving enough, you'll be rewarded with a narrative experience that will make you laugh, cry, and perhaps yearn for York's trademark monologues long after the credits roll. For more reviews, previews, and guides, like this video, subscribe, and click the bell for more videos at youtube.com/NewGamePlusTV. Also, be sure to check out our Twitch channel where we run games nightly during the week at twitch.tv/NewGamePlusTV, which can be found through the links in the description of this video. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.